A reading is from Thomas More's new book, A Religion of One's Own, a section called Emerson's Way. Thomas More, you know, was not a UU. He was a Roman Catholic. He was a Roman Catholic monk for 13 years. Now he advocates each of us to make our own religion out of the stuff of our childhoods and the stuff that's in there in the traditions, the great world religions. So here he concentrates on someone who is, of course, a saint to the Unitarians. Ralph Waldo Emerson was steeped in formal religion and yet willing to go his own way spiritually. Educated at Harvard, he became a Unitarian minister in Boston. But soon he got involved in a controversy about Holy Communion and left the ministry, becoming a spiritual teacher and lecturer. In his mid-30s, he gave a lecture at Harvard, now known as the Divinity School Address. Only a small number of people were present, but the impact of the speech was significant. The religious establishment criticized him and didn't invite him back to Harvard for almost 30 years. This one talk set his life off in a new direction, becoming what could be the very model for creating a religion of one's own. In the Divinity School Address, a forerunner of this book you hold in your hands, Emerson criticizes Christianity for emphasizing the personality of Jesus and yet making little of his humanity. He complains about the churches giving too much attention to miracles. The very word miracle, as pronounced by Christian churches, gives a false impression. It is monster. It is not one with the blowing clover and the falling rain. That's a quote from the Divinity School Address. Emerson, let me give you that again. The very word miracle, as pronounced by Christian churches, gives a false impression. It is monster. It is not one with the blowing clover and the falling rain. And Thomas More continues, I've become a follower of Emerson for that one sentence, the miracle of the blowing clover and the falling rain. Just imagine what it would do for your religion if you shifted your sense of the miraculous from some astounding feat of a master magician to a profound appreciation of the miracle of rain. You would be a different kind of person, living a different kind of life. You wouldn't be sad from the weight of your religious obligations, but rather joyful at the beauty and holiness of the natural world. You'd be happy, open, and graceful, all because of your positive, world-based spiritual vision. Emerson emphasizes the spiritual power of the individual person. The man on whom the soul descends, through whom the soul speaks, alone can teach. That's the quote. Emerson speaks of the divinity of the person. Quote, in how many churches is man made sensible that he is an infinite soul, that the earth and heavens are passing into his mind, that he is drinking forever the soul of God. Emerson continues, it does little good to try to create new myths, rites, and forms. The remedy to their deformity is, first, soul, and second, soul, and evermore, soul. End quote. You see why I, an author of several books on the soul, like Emerson so much. Emerson doesn't recommend making new religions because you can't manufacture a religion, nor does he advocate becoming an atheist. Atheism tends to be nothing more than yet another too earnest religion, with the added problem of being excessively rationalistic. The best way to live a more soulful life, allowing for mystery and arranging life around that mystery. That sentence did not come through clearly. The best way is to live a more soulful life, allowing for mystery and arranging life around that mystery. This keeps the reality of God, but empty about ideas of who or what God is. Let me give you that sentence again. This keeps the reality of God, but empty of our ideas of who or what God is. Faith and atheism blend into a sacred theology. You don't need the word God. You need the reality, the sense of otherness in creation, an opening to the transcendent. The words of Thomas More. Thank you. Miracle on Main Street. 18 years ago tomorrow, a handful of intrepid UUs who had been meeting for 10 years at various spots around Chatham without a building or regular minister marched down Crowell Road to take possession of this, their new building. The number of that handful is kind of flexible. I've always heard it said that the fellowship was 35, but there are 52 names on the plaque at the rear of the sanctuary. Of these 52, 7 are still with us today. But it is said that first Sunday, the membership of the new church grew to 75, and by the end of that year, it had reached 200. That this little group could buy this property and set up a church so firmly was why this founding was called the Miracle on Main Street. That is our founding myth. There's nothing wrong with having a founding myth. In fact, it is a good and healthy to have it, as long as we don't get trapped by it. We're now in the middle of a conversation about where this church is and where it's going. We had a good meeting in August, and we are scheduled to have a follow-up meeting the last Saturday of October. I think it's worth taking this anniversary date to deconstruct this founding myth and try to discern the extent to which it helps us and the extent to which we live in its shadow. Last week, for the Jewish High Holy Days, I related the various covenants recounted in the Torah that God makes with Noah, Abraham, and Jacob. I then brought the history forward from these patriarchal times to show that the fortunes of the Jewish people did not evidence God's favor in any straightforward or conventional way, for they had a few centuries where they seemed in control of their destinies, but many more where they were overrun, conquered, oppressed, and dispersed, up to the time when a more recent regime made a concerted effort to murder them all. One fascinating aspect of this is that many scholars think that the Torah in its present form was last edited after the Babylonian captivity. That is, as the Jews were trying to reconstruct life, faith, society, ritual, and they still included those promises from God, which history had not vindicated. You might think an editor, knowing the disasters of the recent past, would have omitted the stories of promises from God which did not seem to have been fulfilled. Perhaps the editors intended these promises to be a rallying point for Jewish recovery. And what that says to me is that miraculous origin stories have their main focus in the present, not the past or future. New Testament scholars believe that the miracle stories of Jesus' birth, the angels and shepherds in Luke, the Magi and the star in Matthew, were features added at a date later than the body of the Gospels. The miracle birth narratives of Jesus parallel those of other great religious leaders. When Confucius' mother was in labor, there appeared in the sky 2 fiery dragons, writhing, then 5 old sages, and then 5 musicians. When the child had been born, they noticed 5 red characters on his chest, and these were finally translated as a prophecy that he would be a great king. Of course, the prophecy was wrong. Confucius never was a king, but he was a wise man who taught kings how to rule justly. Before the Buddha was born, it was said that his mother's womb became transparent and she could see her baby there. She gave birth standing up, and 4 devas, or heavenly spirits, were there to catch the child. There was no blood or other fluid or dirt, but the child descended as a precious jewel wrapped in a beautiful cloth. And at the moment of his birth, there were 2 showers of rain, one warm and one cool. Miracle birth stories are a way of honoring a great religious leader. person who shows us new levels of insight, who reveals to us new truths about the world or about ourselves. For miracle stories are a way of saying that God has smiled on our enterprise. In ancient Rome, when big decisions had to be made, a specialist called auspex or haruspex was called in to examine the entrails of dead animals to determine whether conditions were auspicious for the proposed enterprise. People conducted their lives by signs and portents. If there was a miracle at the birth of a person, this was a sign that the person was specially destined to lead or to prophesy. The Universalists had a miracle story which is often told. John Murray, a refugee from England, had sailed to America determined to start his life over and never preach again. But his ship was blown off course and ran aground on the New Jersey coast. An illiterate but successful farmer named Thomas Potter had become convinced that a loving God did not condemn any person to hell, and God directed him to build a chapel in the corner of his cornfield for the preacher who would come and preach this truth of universal salvation. Murray met Potter while he was walking on the road in search of some food for the ship's crew. The ship could not be gotten off the sandbar until the wind shifted direction. Potter gave him some fish for the crew, and on hearing of Murray's theological convictions, determined he had been sent by God. Murray refused Potter's pleas to preach, but then relented and said he would if the wind did not shift before Sunday. The wind held its direction until Murray had finished preaching to a packed house that Sunday, and then shifted to allow the ship to proceed on. Here in Chatham, we had a Universalist church from 1823 until 1960, the first Universalist church established on Cape Cod. When the first building was built, a member of the church wrote that several Orthodox Christians were praying over the building materials, which had been brought in by barge, praying that the tide would wash them out to sea before the building could be built. But the tide did not do that. The building was built despite the opposition of the Orthodox. That church outgrew its first two buildings, and in the 1870s they erected their third building on Main Street, just beyond where the Orpheum Theater is now. Just after the building was completed, there was a hurricane which destroyed the surrounding buildings but left the new church building intact, which is why ever after it was called the church the hurricane built, a kind of miracle story in itself. But such auspicious beginnings did not guarantee long life or prosperity. By the early 20th century, the Chatham Universalist Church had become a summer-only church, and in 1944, another hurricane took off the steeple and did extensive damage. The congregation had to decide whether to repair, sell, or abandon. They decided to try to make a go of it, called the new minister, and scraped together the funds to repair the building. But membership dwindled in the 1950s, and in 1960 they sold the building to the Episcopalians. It is today St. Christopher's Church. Right about that time, the Unitarians and Universalists nationally were consolidated, and then the Universalists in Chatham would only have the choice of going to First Parish Brewster, Unitarian Universalist. The story of this meeting house begins in First Parish Brewster 25 years later. That church had almost closed its doors in the late 1970s, but then experienced a resurgence under Jim Robinson and an influx of young families into that town. By the mid-1980s, Jim was looking to relieve the church's growing pains, and he sent some of his best members to Chatham to form a fellowship. Brewster had ordained an active layman, Peter Fleck, and Peter began preaching for the Chatham Fellowship once a month. The fellowship met at different places in Chatham, but finally settled in the Creative Arts Center. Membership stayed steady in the mid-30s until in 1996, Peter Fleck died. It was Ruth Fleck who had the vision to see the fellowship evolve to something else. She agreed to give the group enough money to hire a full-time minister for a year. The fellowship chose Ed Hardy, who was then a student minister at First Parish Brewster. Ed went off to General Assembly that year as the representative of the Chatham Fellowship, And while he was there, folks in Chatham heard that the Christian Scientists were consolidating their Chatham and Harwich churches and selling their Chatham building right at the stoplight. A group investigated and started negotiations. But how would a group of 35 souls, mostly retirees, buy a building right in the center of town? They went to the EUA, who said, we can give you advice, but no money. Then they went to First Parish Brewster, who agreed to give them a loan. And that's what enabled them to march down Crowell Road on that brilliant October morning to take possession of this building. And they paid First Parish, our mother church, back every penny of what they had borrowed. We call it the miracle on Main Street. But what is a miracle? Did anyone suspend the laws of nature to establish this church? Did anyone walk on water, or make the sun stand still, or change water into wine? No, I don't think that anyone who uses the phrase miracle on Main Street means that something happened which violated the laws of nature. But violating the laws of nature is not the only meaning for the word miracle. This is what Emerson meant in the quotes from the Divinity School address that Thomas More offered up in today's reading. The Christian churches of Emerson's day argued that Jesus was the Son of God, and the miracles related in the Gospels were proof, because only God would have enough power to walk on water or raise the dead. Emerson, this is important to remember, Emerson was as much a naturalist as he was a mystic, and he rejected this reasoning. If God was anything, God was the natural laws themselves, and it would make no sense to hold that God violated himself. But the word miracle can be broader than that. Miracle is that which gives you insight into the holiness that is around you all the time. Let me repeat that. Miracle is that which gives you insight into the holiness that is around you all the time. It is the blowing clover and the falling rain. Once at General Assembly, I was in a worship service which featured a dramatic reenactment of the miracle of the loaves and fishes. The minister assumed the role of a woman in the crowd following Jesus in the loaves and fishes story. The way this story is told in the Bible, Jesus miraculously feeds a crowd of 5,000 with 2 barley loaves and 5 small fishes. As the minister retold, or rather reenacted the story, it turned out that she had brought a little bit of food that day for herself and her 2 children to eat on the road back home. When they started calling out for people to contribute to the common basket, she held back because she was saving this food for herself and her own. But then something came over her. She had a change of heart. Suddenly sharing with everyone on that hillside became more important than keeping the food for herself. And as she opened her cloak to contribute the food she'd been hoarding, she saw that everyone else in the crowd was doing the same thing. So the miracle happened. The crowd got fed. But the miracle happened through a change of heart, not a suspension of natural law. I think that's how a lot of miracles happen. It reminds me of the old story of the atheist and the Loch Ness Monster. The atheist is fishing alone in a small boat in Loch Ness when there's suddenly a roiling of the water, and right next to his boat, the Loch Ness Monster rears its huge head. The atheist starts rowing away as fast as he can, but the monster pursues him and chokes away the back third of the boat in one bite. This, of course, flips the atheist up in the air, and he yells, "God help me!" The scene freezes, and a voice comes from the clouds. "What did you say? I thought you didn't believe in me." The atheist replies, "Give me a break. 10 seconds ago, I didn't believe in the Loch Ness Monster either." God says, "What do you want me to do?" The atheist says, "Can't you just make the monster disappear?" God says, "No. That's what people like you don't understand. I don't do magic. I can just change people's hearts." So the atheist thinks and says, "Okay, well, Make the monster a Christian then. So the scene unfreezes, and the atheist starts back down into the waiting jaws of the monster, who gets a beautiful, peaceful smile on his face, folds his claws heavenwards, and says, "For what we're about to receive may we be free." Change of heart. Change of heart. It was a miracle that the little band of 35 or 52 or however many they were able to buy this building in 1996. With that explosive growth in the first year, a lot of people assumed that the problem the church would face was that the building was too small. So sketches were drawn up for building additions that would give us a Sunday school wing, elevator, kitchen. They still sit in my office, and no one has consulted them in years, because the church went a different way. And the miracle on Main Street can haunt us if we let it, and say we won't be worthy, we won't be a success unless we get back to that membership figure we had in that first year. But my friends, growth does not have to be measured in membership numbers. It can be measured in spiritual depth, in the extent to which our actual living here bears witness to our religious values, in the miracle of maintaining a church where everyone can pursue her or his own vision of the holy and yet walk together with no creed. For indeed the miracles have not stopped. It was a miracle that we were able to get a religious education program up and running in the town with the highest median age in the state. It was a miracle that we could in 2 years acquire a first-rate piano, replace our decrepit organ with a state-of-the-art electronic instrument, purchase and install a lift for the mobility impaired, successfully navigate a sabbatical for your minister and reintegrate him on his return. But these are only the surface miracles. The real miracles are how we relate to each other day in and day out, standing by to support one another, calling each other up every morning to make sure we're still on the right side of the earth, dealing with our victories and our defeats, our needs and our gifts. Each day is a miracle. A lot of good ideas came out at the first vision and conversation. Maybe we need a capital campaign. Maybe we need to redo the sanctuary floor or put in movable seating. Maybe we need to experiment with different musical styles. These are all worthy questions. And it is our church, and we will deliberate on these together. Meanwhile, the real work of the church goes on between people. Within a few years of the march down Crowell Road, this congregation met at the Methodist Church to hammer out a vision statement, which is printed in your newsletter every month. I encourage you to read it. The first part of the statement is also its most general: to apply UU principles in our daily living, social actions, and community service. I say it is the most general because no two UUs will agree on exactly what UU principles are. If we mean to incorporate the 7 principles and purposes, these are very broad. They're expressed in intentionally abstract language, but they do reflect deeply held values which come to the fore in particular situations. They're not so much followed as they are lived. And I think to the list of miracles since 1996, we ought to add that this congregation came through a particularly difficult patch in the mid-2000s. Many of you here today were not here then, and I arrived 3 years after the greatest stress. But I discussed that period in depth with the ministers who preceded me here, and I've gotten bits and pieces since then. From all I understand, there were distinct factions, and there were sincere disagreements about policies, and there were some very difficult meetings, and Ed finally resigned for good. After your 2 interims, the search committee which called me expressed the hope that I could help the congregation put the troubles of the past behind them. I found you didn't need much help. This may be because you had such good interim ministers, but I think it was also because you were willing to do the hard work yourselves. As divisive as that period was, you seem to have transcended your divisions. In my 6 years here, you have individually gone through changes of heart, and that has meant that the congregation has advanced and deepened. As Seamus Heaney put it, call the miracle self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. It is a miracle that scars heal, that people come together and carry on. Here's my confession. Here I'm going to come out of the closet and reveal to you an essential truth about myself. I am hopeful. I not only believe in miracles, I expect them and predict that this congregation, which at 18 years is now old enough to vote, will continue to experience miracles on Main Street on a regular basis. Amen. Now let there be an offering to sustain the strength of this place. This is church. You can't applaud in church.